that is increasingly highly every year, despite all what we are trying to do as civil society, despite the protocol and the agreements, so there is something to do. So we have a very distinguished panel here, and I leave it up to the hands of Taghreed, the director of PRI for the MENA region that we have the pleasure to have with us in this distinguished panel. Taghreed, up to you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Alex, for the introduction, and thank you, DCI, and everyone who was involved in actually organizing, arranging this very important conference. Is timely in terms of the end of the year, and at the same time, the fact that we always need to remind ourselves that we need to step back and reflect. And where are we? And what should be done, and how we can rectify or enhance our this event. Penal Reform International is delighted to be part of this important event. Now, as Alex said, we are going to the last plenary session that is focusing on children deprived of liberty in context of armed conflict or national security. And during the discussion, we will highlight the difference, and it's important that we make sure that there's a distinguish between children who are detained for armed conflict and at the same time or for national security, and this is what our speakers will highlight further. Without any further ado, and because we have lost actually 15 minutes from our session, and to make sure that we keep on track for the rest of the day, I will go directly to our first speaker on the panel. You all heard of Guantanamo Bay, and we all have really vivid memories and ideas about what has been going in that detention facility. We all heard horrific stories about torture, ill treatment, indefinite detention, and many of us wonder what is the fate of those who were kept inside that detention facility. That poses lots of questions about its legality and a real challenge to the international standards for human rights, and how certain powers are willing really to actually provoke these rights without any questioning. Today, I want you all to welcome with me a former detainee at Guantanamo Bay while he was a child. He will take us through his experience in detention and after detention, where in his society as a Canadian citizen with family and children. Welcome with me, Omar, for an inspirational talk for 5 minutes and take us through this journey. Omar, the floor.
Good morning. Me here and letting me share some thoughts with you. I'm here today to share a success story in this dark time of history we live in. But I thought to myself, I will share a story and let you decide whether it's a success or a failure. I will ask, though, a few preconceived notions as possible. Children of the world with childish dreams and fears. A child who grew up with his family. On one of these travels with his family, war broke out. This child was separated from his family, bombed, shot, lost his vision, and almost lost his life. By the grace of God, that child lived and survived, and he was removed from the war zone. The child thought that his hurt and his suffering were over. He didn't know that the people who took him, the ones who spoke his language and shared his culture, would put him through 10 years of torture and abuse. The abuse started right when he woke up in the hospital. This child was physically, emotionally, and psychologically abused. The child was desperate for the hurt to stop, pain and hurt to stop. He realized that the only way out of this hellhole was to give his abusers what they wanted: a false confession, an admission. When the child knew for sure that his nightmares were over, again, his hopes were crushed. He was again put in prison for years where he would be abused and his life would be in danger. The abuse didn't stop when he was finally released. His so-called freedom was bound by extremely harsh conditions for years. He was banned from practicing his faith or speaking his mother language. He was made to be a violent and dangerous terrorist by his political leaders and media. This, of course, negatively affected all his attempts for a normal life. This child's biggest dream was to become a healthcare provider. He knew and understood pain and wanted to help people alleviate their pains. Unfortunately, he had to let that dream go because of all the legal battles that he had to fight. The child, who wasn't a child by age anymore, only wanted one thing. He just wanted to be out of war. But all he faced for years were battles on all sides. When he couldn't handle it anymore and his spirit broke, and when he could finally travel, he decided to return to a war zone because it was like he had never left. I know this isn't the success story you wanted to hear, but we should ask ourselves, whose fault is it? Is it the fault of the child for not being able to handle abuse, torture, and despair? Or is it the fault of every adult and authority around him that put him through it? Fortunately, this isn't how the real story ended. The now young man didn't give in to despair, nor did he go back to a war zone. That child now stands amongst you, sharing his story, a husband and a father, whole but not unscarred. My success was in spite of failures of governments and institutions. My success was by the grace of God. My success was because of good individuals like the people in this room, who did not give up and who did work to protect children. It is true that I am only one person and that my story could just be a statistic in a report. But it represents how we think of children around the world, what happens when children from a certain place or a certain faith are no longer seen as children. What makes my story different is that the perpetrators of my abuse and torture are governments that proclaim themselves to be protectors of the rights of children. This is relevant, especially in the context of what is happening right now in Palestine to Palestinian children. Children are extremely resilient. Their hope can recover and flourish even after going through extremely harsh situations. Children should not be burdened by the failures of the adults around them. What children need most from adults is to protect and cherish their hope. Children's hope is the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar. Thank you very much for highlighting this experience. We highly appreciate your openness towards us and highlighting a key issue about whose fault is that. And are we really treating these children as perpetrators, or are they really victims? And this is the big question that we all need to answer and highlight today through all of our deliberations, and how can we really help states to strike the balance between the protection of these children and their national security measures. This will let me go directly to our second speaker on this panel, Professor Fionnuala Aoláin. And I'm sorry if I didn't pronounce your name correctly. Professor Aoláin is the former Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism. And currently she is a professor at the University of Minnesota Law School and professor of law at Queen's University, Belfast, Northern Ireland. She will take us in through her speech by providing an overview of the current practices applied to children deprived of liberty on national security grounds, and discussing the trends, the challenges, and the intersection of the global counterterrorism architecture and norms, including counterterrorism measures with children's rights. Professor, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks to Omar. And it's worth remembering that there are still 27 men detained at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, who should not be there. I want to start by framing the context, and the context I'd like to put before you today is the parasitic and mestetizing growth of institutional and normative counterterrorism in the aftermath of 9/11. We've seen that within the UN itself, from the UN's Office of Counterterrorism to the Global Counterterrorism Coordination Compact to UN's Security Growth on Sanctions Committee and beyond. But it's not just that counterterrorism has grown and legitimized within the UN system, eating up many things around it, but that it is layered with things like private-public partnerships and the growth of entities across the globe, like the Financial Action Task Force, the Global Counterterrorism Forum. So simply to say that institutional counterterrorism is on the move, and with it comes a normative framework that is fundamentally at odds in many parts with the protection of human rights, including the rights of children. Core to this problem is the lack of a definition of terrorism, and thus what we have is the permissibility of global counterterrorism and security infrastructures in a context where states effectively get to call whomever they like, including thousands and thousands of children, as terrorists. The context is also the ever-widening, what my mandate called playbook of counterterrorism, which involves not just criminal and detention sanctions against children and adults, but also the use of civil, administrative, and increasingly technological measures, including surveillance against children, based on the gender of the child, the geography in which the child is found, and the family ties, presumed or actual. It is also the growth of the language of association, which deems children terrorist simply by virtue of the people they are born to or the people around them. Normative counterterrorism is what we might say increasingly a fourth pillar of the United Nations, and it is of enormous concern to me that it displaces and in many ways seeks to replace norms, and perhaps the most endangered species of norm is international humanitarian law. I want to particularly highlight the vulnerability of IHL and the protections for children in international humanitarian law, as counterterrorism in a muscular way, seeks to move in and displace these protective norms with kinetic capacity of counterterrorism. I particularly want to focus on the boy child because I think the boy child occupies a particularly precarious space in armed conflict and security context. His theoretical status, both as a civilian and a child, should offer elevated protection from the vicissitudes of harm in conflict and in security context. In practice, the boy child's sex operates as a constraint on the protection that he receives, undermining both the requirements of civilian protection, but particularly the special protections owed to children in times of armed conflict or to children who are caught up in the maelstrom of security-defined situations. While a boy should always be presumptively thought of as a civilian, increasingly boys are treated or thought of as men, and thus liable to the forms of repression and harm that are inflicted on men of, quote, battle age in both terrorism and armed conflict contexts. I'm not going to talk about the scores of human rights treaties from the ICCPR to the CRC that are in place to protect the child. In theory, they should protect the child, and they apply fully in situations of context. And they also apply in situations where non-state armed groups designated by the UN as terrorist organizations are in control of territory. But in reality, these treaties and the soft law that supplements them, whether it's the UN minimum standards on the protection of juveniles deprived of liberty, the Beijing rules, or the Paris principles, or even the Vancouver principles, in reality, the application of this soft and hard law remains peripatetic and inconsistent for children. And in particular, it is the elevation of counter-terrorism norms that directly impinge on the capacity of these treaties to protect children, as well as the increasing role that counter-terrorism soft law is playing in undermining the rights of the child. We've had several articulations of concern about the encroachment of counter-terrorism discourse and practice on the rights of the child. In SRSG on children in armed conflict and the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, represented here today on this panel, expressed their alarm at, quote, the increasing practices of arresting and detaining children identified as associated with armed groups. But despite that alarm, the situation of children remains one of the most precarious under the rule of counterterrorism. And the place I want to close out by illustrating the scale and nature of that problem is not just, and I think, cogently illustrated by Guantanamo, but actually a direct line can be taken from Guantanamo to the current situation in northeast Syria, where thousands of children are detained, and that situation illustrates not the location of his birth, but the permissibility of holding children of legal process simply because of their that they are in fact either terrorist or quasi-terrorist. Territory where designated terrorist groups are operative, geography becomes destiny for a child, and it functions as the first set of factors that make for the of terrorist status for children. The second is religious identity, and I think it is absolutely critical to name the extent to which Muslim boys carry the burden that their religious affiliation dangerousness. We see that, we saw it in Guantanamo, we see it in Syria, we also see it in the Palestinian context. The third factors, I think, are the paternal links to men who were members of organizations. So boys who are connected to fathers, brothers, uncles, and grandfathers who are deemed suspect by the state. Those boys lose the protection of both human rights and humanitarian law because of a set of assumptions of their inherent extremism. And the fourth factor pulling a boy away from civilian or protective status is the presumption that his mother, no matter how she has landed in Syria, whether by coercion, trafficking, grooming, or otherwise, is a member of a terrorist group. In northeast Syria, it's fair to say that the language of exceptionalism pervades every way in which the boy child is defined. Media reporting, which should be, I think, firmly eschewed, uses this inflammatory language, terms like cubs of the caliphate, extremists, terrorists, to describe 2, 3, 4, and 5-year-olds born in a place where they have no choice and harmed in ways that we cannot imagine. And it is this language of association that has become so dangerous for the child in so many places, justifying their detention. This justification of detention, this sleight of hand that displaces the child's status with a de facto presumed terrorist designation, justifies by many states, including democracies, the democracies who are refusing to bring their children home from northeast Syria, justifies treating these children as presumed terrorists or terrorists in waiting. And that logic is both inescapable and utterly unacceptable. The boy child is excluded from protection, both as a potential or actual terrorist, in a kind of Schrodinger's cat exercise of life and death for the child who cannot escape the inevitability of being put into that box, no matter what he does, by virtue of his geography, gender, and religious identity. So in an absolutely brutal way, these realities undermine the child's status and the protection of the child. It's worth saying, as we sit in this room today, as Syria is in this process of transition and change, we have a massive child population. In Al-Hol camp alone, 60% of the population is under aged 12, arbitrarily detained without any legal process. And the range of rights violations in these places of detention include torture, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, as well as the lack of possibility for education or any other fundamental right we assume a child should have. I think it's important to say that we see the work of counterterrorism not just doing this work of detention, but also structurally denying and undermining other rights. For example, the procedural rights that a child should have if they are subject to any form of process. We see the lowering of the age of legal responsibility. We see lack of access to lawyers, and the list goes on. And so all to say, by closing, that actually, as we've seen the elevation of counterterrorism discourses over the past 20 years, we've also seen the parallel diminution of the rights of the child. And let no one be under any illusion, one of the most significant threats to the Convention on the Rights of the Child today is the growth of global counterterrorism and the undermining of legal systems of protection for the child in this way. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Aoláin, and thank you for highlighting the whole issue of de facto presumptions that because of geography, religion, family, history, you're already labeled and associated. And actually the fact that thousands of children have been detained only for expressing their views. We have seen at the study that has reflected why that many children were detained when they were demonstrating actually in the street, trying to express their views about the system, the regime, and because the states have that right for a wide definition of terrorism, those children were detained and actually for prolonged periods and tried under counter-terrorism or under terrorism crimes. Thank you very much for your highlight. And now we will continue actually with Ms. Mikiko Otani, member of the Committee on the Rights of the Child, and she was the former chair of the committee. She's an international human rights lawyer with a long-time practice experience and civil society background. Ms. Otani will actually highlight the challenges in preventing the deprivation of liberty of children in armed conflict, and under national security charges. She will emphasize the importance of child rights approach and the role of collaboration of relevant UN mandate and mechanisms to provide more protection in line of all the challenges that we're facing right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I also want to thank the organizers for having me, and also thank Omar for sharing his experience. I came all the way from Tokyo to speak at this session. Despite the complexity and sensitivity of this issue, we must apply child rights approach. And I believe it is a role and responsibility of the Committee on the Rights of the Child to advocate the child rights approach to all matters concerning children. All persons below the age of 18 years are children. All children must be treated as children, no matter what their status or the context. This is the key message of the joint statement issued by the CRC to SRSGs for children and armed conflict and on violence against children, UNICEF and UNODC on 6th of October 2022. Arbitrary detention is a violation of child rights. All children are entitled to the right to be protected from arbitrary detention in all contexts without discrimination of any kind, regardless of their or their parents' status, such as the association or alleged association with armed groups, including those designated as terrorists. This children's rights is not respected and even pushed back. The Global Study Report in 2019 is a landmark document building upon the Security Council Resolution 2427 in 2018, which emphasized that children associated with armed forces and armed groups should be treated primarily as victims. The global study recognized armed conflict and national security as specific situations of children deprived of liberty, described its serious negative harms to children, and provided detailed recommendations from child rights perspectives. But it is my observation that armed conflict and national security related detention of children has not yet received the same level of attention and call for ending this practice as in other contexts. Why so? Despite the fact that Convention on the Rights of the Child applies both in times of peace and conflict, and the national security legislation cannot prevail over the Convention. The reasons may be lack of data, information, or complexity and sensitivity of this issue, or perception that these are the special areas where child rights community is not familiar with. All may be true, but it is high time we must double our efforts to end child detention in these contexts. Of course, it is the obligation of states, but there are more that we can and should do in our respective mandates and laws. I hope that at this conference we gather action-oriented ideas and move forward to make change. Here are my 5 recommendations, which include what I think the CRC committee should do. First, the committee should include the Paris principles and guidelines and handover protocols in the questions and recommendations in country reviews. In particular, rapid handover of children associated with armed groups to child protection actors is the first very critical step to ensure that those children are treated as children, focusing on their rehabilitation and reintegration as victims. But it also prevents children from national security-related detention by guaranteeing their rights in the child justice system. Second, the committee should not miss the opportunities to address this issue in the review of all relevant countries. Also, the recommendations should be broad enough to cover not only detention, but also issues such as criminalization and prosecution of children exercising freedom of expression and peaceful assembly under the counter-terrorism legislation, lower minimum age of criminal responsibility, or harsher criminal sanctions to children as counter-terrorism legislation, stigma, mental health, respect of views of children, access to justice and remedies. To do so, the committee needs to receive specific information from stakeholders, UN agencies, civil society, experts, and academia. Which countries have their children detained in camps in northeast Syria? Which countries apply counter-terrorism or national security legislation under which children are actually detained or are faced at the risk of detention? We need your support and input. Third, be proactive for advocacy and mobilization. The CRC committee adopted the decisions in the individual communications cases on repatriation of children from the camps in northeast Syria. In light with this position, the committee, together with the Special Rapporteur on counter-terrorism and human rights, at that time, Fionnuala, urged the repatriation of all such children. I believe that the committee should encourage each and every state whose children are detained there to take actions. Efforts should be expanded also to other treaty bodies, special procedures, mechanisms, and bodies, such as Universal Periodic Review, Human Rights Council, and General Assembly. The upcoming High Commissioner's report and the Human Rights Council's annual day on the rights of the child and the violation of human rights of children in armed conflict are very important, in addition to the upcoming committee's GC27. High Commissioner's report and the Human Rights Council resolution on child rights and family reunification in 2022 are a good example used to highlight the armed conflict and national security-related child detention issues. Kazakhstan organized the side event to the 57th session of the Human Rights Council to share its experiences of returning and reintegrating their children from conflict zones into society. We should collect and share more examples. Fourth, responsibilities of all the states need to be emphasized. Article 7 of the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child on the Involvement of Children in Armed Conflict provides the international cooperation obligation of the state parties for prevention, rehabilitation, and reintegration of child victims of recruitment and use, including through technical assistance, technical cooperation, and financial assistance. Yesterday, we heard that Secertary-General said that detention of children is one of the direct consequences of child recruitment and use. It is necessary to mobilize international cooperation from states targeted to child victims recruited, used, and detained. Specific areas of needs should be identified, such as strengthening child protection capacities for handover, mental health support, catching up education, and technical support for child justice system. Fifth and last, mainstream child rights in the counter-terrorism and national security area at the UN and also at the national levels. Both SGs and CRC in the joint statement on 14th March 2023, already mentioned by Fionnuala, urged the need to ensure child's rights while implementing counter-terrorism and national security measures. In accordance with the SG's guidance note on child rights mainstreaming, child rights must be integrated into all the work of the UN related to counter-terrorism and national security to establish and promote the standard and practice that counter-terrorism should not be used as grounds for detention of children. I conclude by reiterating that children associated with armed groups should be treated primarily as victims, but I add they are agents of change and important partners. Child rights approach is a pathway to build a sustainable, inclusive, and peaceful society. I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Otani, for these recommendations, which I'm sure will be very useful in the breakout discussion where we can actually build more on them and see how they can lead the way forward. And thank you for emphasizing the child rights approach and the key message that the study kept saying that detention should be as last resort and for the shortest period possible. In the breakouts, we're going to be also discussing the handover protocols further, and we are going to be looking forward for receiving more recommendations on how we can provide technical support for states to apply all of these measures and the recommendations that were mentioned. Then we'll move now to our next speaker, Mr. Alec Wargo, who is the Program Officer of the Special Representative of the Office at the Office of the Special Representative of the Secretary-General for Children and Armed Conflict. Mr. Wargo has a very interesting, actually, CV. He has more than 20 years experience working on with different humanitarian and peace operations in Europe, Africa, Asia, with UNHCR, with the DPKO, and different places. And yesterday we had a chat, me and him, about his very interesting work with NATO, actually, as an advisor for the special representative responsible for human security. NATO and children, which is a very interesting area of discussion and topic. However, today he's going to be discussing with us how UN efforts to monitor and report on the impact of the application of national security lens on managing child exit from armed groups. Please.
Thank you so much. It's a bit intimidating with going from Omar to Fionnuala to Mikiko to have anything else to say on this topic, but I digress because we do have more to say, and some of it's not as hopeful as I would think, but I will round up with, I hope, some points to go forward. Ladies and gentlemen, last year was the worst year ever recorded for children in armed conflict. And this year is going probably to continue that trend. A central element of the growing pattern of violations against children is child deprivation of liberty in both armed conflict and national security contexts. Deprivation of liberty has become a key concern for the mandate of the Office of the SRG for Children in Armed Conflict. The UN Security Council mandated monitoring and reporting mechanism, the MRM, on grave violations against children in armed conflict follows trends in deprivation of liberty of children as it relates to real or alleged association with armed groups, including groups designated terrorists by the UN. The latest annual report of the Secretary-General notes the following disturbing trends. In Iraq, and again, we do not have full information, this is what we can verify on the ground, 749 children are held under national security charges for either suspected association with or family association with Daesh. In Israel and Palestine, 906 children are being held under national security charges. 49 of those children are being held under administrative detention. All are or will be adjudicated in a military commission or court. In Nigeria, 141 children are being deprived of their liberty under national security charges stemming from their or their parents' perceived or actual association with a terrorist group. In northeast Syria, as everyone has noted, 800 children are being held in prisons or prison-like facilities for alleged association with the Daesh. A further 29,000 children are being held in inhumane conditions in internment camps and other detention facilities with family members assumed to be associated with Daesh. My special representative has highlighted the practice of the forceful separation of boys aged between 10 and 12 years of age, taken from their mothers and placed in so-called rehabilitation centers where there is no possible exit. A new twist to gendered violence. Although the MRM has covered deprivation of liberty for some time, and more and better data is always necessary, the real question that we must pose about justice for children does not concern monitoring reporting, but how we all can engender a paradigm shift in a steadily degrading global trend on deprivation of liberty for children, associated or allegedly associated with armed groups, including those designated terrorists by the United Nations. Until the global war on terror, child deprivation of liberty in national security contexts was confined to one or two conflict situations under the Children in Armed Conflict mandate. Though even that, then, it had all the hallmarks of the child harm that we see today. Torture, sexual assault and violence in custody, secrecy and lack of access for protection actors, administrative detention, long or endless pretrial detention, no judicial oversight, and the list goes on. Serious as those violations were, there was a way to draw a line between them and the larger CAC agenda, where, with the assistance of UNICEF, concerned child protection actors, and NGOs, thousands of children were assisted to exit armed groups each year and the necessity to engage with all armed groups to develop UN Security Council mandated action plans for release of children and to manage child exits was broadly accepted. But now, this line has blurred. And child deprivation of liberty on national security grounds in the context of counterterrorism has put a severe brake on the exit of children from armed groups, designated or deemed terrorist, and a growing number of armed conflicts. Punitive sanctions and prosecution of children associated with armed groups is a growing trend. Children are not seen as victims anymore, but as threats. The well-established Children Armed Conflict Protective Framework is eroding. But here is another question we should ask. Do these states and armed actors, groups, depriving children of their liberty work in a vacuum? Olara Otunu, the first SRSG for Children in Armed Conflict, always said, to me at least, every group has friends, governments and armed groups alike. The SCDF and its autonomous administration in the northeast Syria, for example, could not sustain the infrastructure for these abuses, the camps and prisons, without outside assistance. And we need to place more direct and, if necessary, public pressure on these enabling actors responsible for abuses either directly or indirectly. Dire as the situation appears, there are glimmers of hope. As others have stated, and my colleagues will shortly present, there is a slowly expanding set of promising practices by states which have the best interests of the child at heart and where deprivation of liberty of children is actually the last option. These are examples that we should share and laud broadly. There is also a growing body of research that states that children associated with terrorist groups, whether or not they're designated by the UN or others, have and can successfully reintegrate if given the chance. I'd like to cite O'Neill and Van Broekhoven's UNU research, which provides convincing evidence that there is no difference in how children enter and successfully exit armed groups or designated terrorist groups. We have to push the way they go in and the way they come out are the same no matter what kind of armed group you're looking at, even if it's a state armed group, and we have quite a few of those. So this difference, this constructed difference, is something that we have to call out. And we have to approach member states and push it home. So again, how to effect this necessary paradigm shift to push the best interests of children to the center of our global response to counterterrorism and restore the primacy of child release and reintegration from armed groups, whether or not they are designated terrorists. These are a few ideas I would like to present in broad brushstrokes that we might discuss later on today. And there are 6 of them. I hope you'll bear with me. The first is many counter-terror and national security efforts are masked by coalitions and unclear mixes of national and hybrid actors. We should work together to engage these coalitions when we can, and hybrid arrangements, and discuss with them the necessity to abide by well-established child protection principles and call them to account when they do not. For Northeast Syria, we should ensure that we are sitting at the table reminding member states that they are part of the global, who are part of the global coalition to defeat Daesh, of their obligations vis-a-vis child rights. We must maintain the Security Council Resolution 1612, mandated action plan and handover process, and engagement with violating parties as it pertains to all armed groups without distinction, including those designated terrorists, to ensure exit avenues remain open to children. Nothing less will do. The Paris principles, including the principle that children associated with armed groups are primarily victims, needs good practice guidance that signatories should endorse regarding prevention of deprivation of liberty that applies in both armed conflict and national security contexts. The UN must speak with one voice. No support to abusers of those who do not abide by child rights principles in counterterrorism efforts. The ongoing UN system-wide human rights due diligence process underway may be an avenue in this regard. We must further examine the advisability of UN support to counterterrorism efforts for groups who are not designated terrorists by the United Nations. And that's something I think that we have to have a fairly deep conversation on. And finally, torture is often associated with counter-terrorism efforts, as are inhuman and degrading treatment, including sexual violence, as a form of torture. Children exposed can be scarred for life. We should not only fight its use, but also have a larger cadre of experts who can address mental health response to torture of children when it happens. And with that, I will close, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Alice, very much for your presentation and for highlighting all the key issues. Thanks for mentioning the fact that these children are really tried in military courts, which is a key issue that we should always highlight. And the whole discussion about the enabling factors and that those groups are not operating out of vacuum is a very important approach and tactic of how to deal on a practical way with this issue and matter. And I really want to thank you very much for mentioning that the UN must speak in one voice, actually, and must refrain from using double standards when dealing with any issue. You know, we cannot criticize the situation in X country and ignore criticizing the same situation that is happening in another country. And unfortunately, what we have been seeing lately with the whole context in Palestine and the Israeli conflict is a clear example, and in Gaza is a clear example sometimes of how this system is failing people on the ground and is actually threatening all the hard work that we have been all working to position the international standards for human rights as the global reference and the principles that we should all follow, and especially in line of the protection of the children. So thank you very much for highlighting this issue. It was very important to be said. And now allow me, please, to welcome our next speaker, Ms. Alexanda Martins, who is the head of the UNODC Global Program to End Violence Against Children. And she has over than 25 years of experience in the field of child protection. She holds a PhD on child rights in administration of justice. And over the past 20 years, she has worked on more than 50 countries in providing and supporting their efforts and providing technical assistance to protect children from crime and violence. Ms. Martins will share with us key findings from a recent UNODC research study, the study called Targeted by Terrorist Child Recruitment, Exploitation and Reintegration in Indonesia, Iraq, and Nigeria.
Good morning to everyone. Thank you, Taghreed. I would like to thank GCI and Alex for inviting me to be part of this panel, and also to greet my fellow panelists, in particular Omar. It's a pleasure to be in the same panel with you. Omar's statement was very strong and asked a very important question: whose fault is this? I would like to be optimistic and think whose responsibility is this to reverse the current terrible trend that we are faced with. So I would like to go back to 2015, when I was first called by a minister in a country in the Sahel, telling me, I am faced with a terrible situation. We just arrested over 100 boys who exit Boko Haram. They're in jail with adults, and we have no idea of how to do with that. Are they victims? Are they offenders? We lock them up, and we really don't understand in the first place what is their legal status. That was the first call. Then many others happened from many countries all over the world, not only in West Africa, but in Southeast Asia, in Central Asia, in North Africa, and the Middle East, and nowadays in Latin America. So back in 2015, what was happening was very clear. Authorities all over the world did not know how to deal with something they were faced with on the ground, and that was the involvement of children with groups that were designated as terrorists. So they came to UNODC because we have a mandate on counter-terrorism and we have a mandate on child rights, say, could you please help? And I had some of my colleagues saying, you have to go, the country, I'm not going to name the country, you have to go and train the CT judges on child-sensitive communication, on child rights. And I go back to the question, whose fault is this? That would have been my fault. If I had said, yes, I will go and train the judges and tick the box, that now they are acquainted with the principles and articles and provisions of the CRC and know how to exercise or perform their roles as judges, prosecutors. So I think that I also would like to start by framing the context. And the context is that the lines between criminality, conflict, insecurity, insurgencies, terrorism are blurred. They are blurred because the phenomena overlap and the international legal regimes also overlap, with the result that the authorities on the ground don't know what is the applicable international legal framework, should know, they don't know. Practitioners, policymakers, professionals don't know how to deal with this situation. So some countries reached out to us, and the first one was Switzerland, second one was Norway, saying, as part of the United Nations Secretariat, we need guidance. Children involved with terrorist groups, how do we deal with that? Now, the narrative matters, because if we open newspapers, on a weekly basis, you will see news about youth engaged with violent extremism, terrorism, and so on and so forth. We're talking about terms that have no definition in international law. So we are guided by assumptions, by fear. Terrorism, as Professor Fionnuala mentioned, there is no definition of terrorism, there is no definition of violent extremism, there is no definition of youth. All of this is opening doors to serious violations of child rights. So 2 points on the context. First, that the lines between criminality, terrorism, organized crime, conflict are very blurred. And the second, we have to acknowledge that what prevails on the ground are security interests. So security-driven responses to dealing with crime and violence is what prevailing over humanitarian interests and human rights interests. Fortunately, we're living through a historical moment where human rights, humanitarian law is ignored. We can't close an eye to what's happening. What is the impact of these on children? The impact, and I think Omar just illustrated the impact, children are victims on both sides. They're victims when they are recruited, instrumentalized, used by groups. You name, you label the groups. Can be maras, can be gangs, can be armed groups, criminal groups, designated as terrorist groups. They're victims on that side, exposed to extreme levels of violence, but they are victims when they are in the hands or in contact with national authorities, being from the security sector or from the justice sector, because they are labeled as terrorists. Again, what is prevailing is to look at children, ignoring their vulnerabilities, ignoring their primary status as victims, but seeing them as threats. We cannot ignore that this is the trend. So it's been 10 years I work on the file of children and counterterrorism. And this year we published the first study on this. There are many studies on children involved with armed groups. This is the first study where we try to understand, is there a difference when children are associated with groups designated as terrorist groups? And there is, of course, the exponentialism, how terrorism is being exploited for political purposes. Our research looked into terrorist groups as listed by the Security Council. However, we also looked very carefully on how national authorities have been defining terrorist groups. And this is another trend. What yesterday was called an organized criminal group in Latin America, today is called a terrorist group. Because terrorism allows for exceptional regimes, and this is happening everywhere in the world. So the research focused on Indonesia, Iraq, and Nigeria. On purpose, we chose 2 countries which have conflict, so conflict context, and Indonesia, which is a non-conflict context. To try to understand, is there a difference? I'm not going to enter into details of the methodological approach we adopted. I invite you all to take a look at the research. And I would like to present some of the findings of the research. The main objective was to inform policymakers and professionals of the protection risks children are faced with in the context of counterterrorism, and to provide evidence on how to improve reintegration efforts in these three countries. So this research piece fell into a framework of technical assistance where the findings of the research were used or are being used by policymakers to advance policy and program. The key findings: child recruitment by terrorist groups is not exceptional. So Alec is right. It largely overlaps with the recruitment by other criminal and armed groups. Children do not join voluntarily. Association is characterized by a spectrum of coercion, and in the UN study, Cradled by Conflict, you can see the spectrum of coercion that also applies in this case. Children's roles vary according to gender, according to the duration of association with these groups. But there is one common element, and this is the trauma of performing and living through violence. The methods of recruitment, however, are very different. Terrorist groups will use specific techniques and campaigns for targeting children. And what's very interesting, one of the results is that ideology is overstated. So you hear all over the world, countries even in Europe, applying the so-called radicalization programs, which is based on assumptions because ideology will play a role, but after these children have been recruited and involved with these groups. Another finding is that we also looked into children's exit and disengagement from terrorist groups, and this happens when they reach a tipping point of negative experience within the groups and positive prospects of life outside the group. In other words, here it's very interesting to analyze how counterterrorism efforts are counterproductive for children to exit from groups. Reintegration. The study shows that reintegration does not present distinct challenges from those faced by children associated with armed groups, but it is much more complex when children are identified as being involved with terrorist groups, because this will end up exacerbating the perception that they are security threats. So what is key here, and here I open a parenthesis, Professor Fionnuala talked and criticized the use of the word association. On purpose we use association, and we use association for this research. It derives from the Paris principles. The objective in using association was exactly to show the overlap between association with armed groups and with terrorist groups, to demonstrate and then highlight that this is not exceptional, but also to demonstrate that these children have a different from the way they are treated by terrorist groups. So association derives from the Paris Principle, from Security Council resolutions, and implies no criminal liability. So it's a neutral term. We are referring in the study to children recruited and exploited by terrorist groups, and also a second category of children, those with links to the foreign terrorist fighters phenomenon, just to be clear about the terms we have been utilizing. So key to the findings is that the stigma faced by these children and the role of securitized and punitive approaches have led to child rights violations, overshadowing the imperative of prevention and reintegration. I will just close 1 minute more, Taghreed, if you allow me, to talk about the key recommendations. The first recommendation is the need, but the urgent need, to overcome fragmented approaches. And these exist within governments, within the United Nations, among civil society organizations. We are giving different names to the same thing. We talked about armed violence, we talk about violence against children, we talk about justice for children, children armed conflict. If we really want to face what is happening on the ground and put children at the center of our efforts, we need to be united, understanding what we are talking about, and understanding the vulnerabilities of these children when they are recruited by groups in conflict and non-conflict contexts, irrespective of the label that I give to these groups. The second key recommendation, the importance of investing in child protection and in child rights as a premise for security and development. And here is the core. The moment you overcome, or at least your narrative overcomes the perceived dichotomy between security and child rights, and operationalize the fact that these are two interconnected and complementary interests, this is the moment that professionals and practitioners will be able to apply it in a different way. Saying children are primarily victims is completely meaningless if you do not give the instruments to judges, to prosecutors, to law enforcement, to militaries, for them to indeed treat children primarily as victims.
Alexandra.
With this, I stop. I invite you all to take a look. I hope we can continue during the breakout sessions, but I invite you all to take a look at the study and to get back to us with criticism, because we're happy to improve. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Alexandra, and please, we want to have you at the breakout session to continue the discussion around that and to know more about this recommendation, and it's very important. Thank you for highlighting the whole issue of stigmatization. It's a key thing that we need to discuss further, and maybe change of terminology where the word exploitation of children should be a key in all of our discussions and debates. Now, allow me to go to our next speaker, Ms. Jo Becker. I know Jo since long time, and we worked together on the study with Manfred and the team. She is the Children Rights Advocacy Director for Human Rights Watch. She has worked on children and armed conflict for more than 25 years. And as I said, she served as the advisory on the advisory board for the study. Jo today will provide an insight into the situation of children, including foreign nationals, a very important category that we need to focus at, detained as ISIS suspect of their family members in northeast Syria. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Taghreed. It's a pleasure to be here today, and especially to be on this panel with Omar Khadr and to have the chance to meet him for the first time. I followed Omar's case for years and traveled to Guantanamo several times to attend military commission hearings for Omar's case and other juvenile detainees at Guantanamo. I remember meeting with the US Department of Defense and the way they refused to acknowledge Omar's status as a child, even though he was only 15 years old. I remember conversations with Canada's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and how they refused to help Omar, even though he was their own citizen. These meetings and conversations were 20 years ago, but unfortunately they are emblematic of how countries continue to deal with children today who have been accused of association with so-called terrorist groups. I want to focus my remarks on the children who remain detained in northeast Syria. I think this is a population that deserves our attention. They constitute the single largest concentration of children arbitrarily deprived of their liberty in the world. So first of all, who are these children? When the global study came out in 2019, we reported that there were as many as 29,000 children detained in northeast Syria. Many of them are Iraqis from the neighboring country, but around 10,000 come from 57 different countries around the world. Many of them were taken to Syria by their parents, who sought to join ISIS or live in the caliphate. A few traveled there on their own. Most were born in Syria or in the camps where they're currently detained. As Fionnuala mentioned, the vast majority are under the age of 12 and far too young to ever have played any active role in ISIS. And yet they're being punished today for the decisions of their parents. Neither the children nor the adults that are detained have ever been brought before judicial authority to determine the necessity or the legality of their detention. This makes their detention arbitrary and unlawful. And detention based solely on family ties is a form of collective punishment, which is a war crime. Conditions in the camps are life-threatening. They're deeply degrading and in many cases inhuman. They've also become increasingly dangerous and violent, as many detainees, including those loyal to ISIS, have carried out murders of other detainees, camp authorities, and aid workers. Human Rights Watch has interviewed mothers who say that they hid their children in their tents to protect them from sexual predators, from abusive camp guards, and from ISIS recruiters and fighters. So what's happened in the last 5 years since the study came out? So since 2019, approximately 36 countries have repatriated some of their nationals from northeast Syria. Iraq has taken back around 10,000 citizens, including many children. In contrast, all other countries of the world combined have accepted around 2,200 children. And the majority of those have been taken back by 5 countries, Russia and 4 Central Asian countries, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. Initially, many countries cited national security concerns for their failure to act, believing that detainees, even children, were national security threats. But for the repatriations that have taken place, there have been several positive developments that I think have influenced countries to a certain extent. One was mentioned by Mikiko. The Committee on the Rights of the Child has taken up individual complaints from Finland and from France regarding their failure to repatriate their children. France, for example, initially repatriated only 35 children on a case-by-case basis. But in February 2022, the committee found that France's failure to repatriate violated their right to life and exposed them to inhuman treatment. A few months later, the European Court of Human Rights instructed France to reconsider requests for repatriation. And since then, France has repatriated more than 130 additional children. I think a second influence has been the very active role of Fionnuala in her role as Special Rapporteur on counter-terrorism. She made this a priority during her mandate, repeatedly urging governments to repatriate their nationals, highlighting the situation of children. She wrote individual complaints to 57 different countries, intervened in court cases, and made clear that repatriation is the only response to the situation in northeast Syria that is compliant with international law. A third factor has been that domestic courts have taken action. For example, Germany initially agreed to take some children back, but they plan to leave their mothers behind in Syria. German courts ruled that this would violate German laws protecting family unity. Germany has subsequently repatriated 80 children and 27 women, and says that this represents nearly all of the German women and children who are willing to return. Domestic courts in the Netherlands, in Denmark, and other countries have also ruled in favor of repatriation and keeping children together with their mothers. And finally, some countries have recognized that repatriation is not only in the best interests of the child, but also in their national security interests. Finland, for example, their envoy for repatriation has said that the longer children remain in the camps, the harder it will be to counter violent extremism and radicalization. By this point, some countries have now repatriated many or most of their nationals, but there are some who have still refused to repatriate any of their children. One example is Trinidad and Tobago, a small Caribbean country, but it is the Western country that had the largest per capita number of citizens to travel to Syria to join ISIS. Since 2019, they have not repatriated a single one of the 90 children that they have remaining in the camps. Similarly, Morocco has at least 300 children that are detained in northeast Syria, but has not repatriated any. We saw an increase in repatriations in 2022 and 2023, but they fell again in 2024. And at current rates, it will take decades to empty the camps of the children. So, as mentioned, some of the countries have been very reluctant to take children back because they see them as national security threats. Some politicians have even referred to these children as ticking time bombs. So a couple of years ago, Human Rights Watch undertook some research to look at children who had been returned to see how they were doing in their home countries. We collected information on about 100 children that had been returned to 7 countries in Western Europe and Central Asia. We found, and you won't be surprised, that these children were not planning terrorist attacks on their local government buildings. In fact, most are in school, they're making friends, they're enjoying the kinds of activities that all children enjoy. They're playing with football or with Lego, they're riding scooters, they're enjoying music, art, dance, sleepovers, trips to the zoo. Family members told us how eager the children are to learn about the new world around them, and how quickly many of them caught up to their peers in school, how some of them are even at the top of their class. Now, to be sure, many of them still face challenges from years in horrific conditions in the camps and the violence of Syria, but many of them are reintegrating remarkably well in their new communities. So just to conclude, the scale of this crisis really demands our continued attention. We need to make it a top priority, particularly given recent events in Syria. I think there are 3 points that we can emphasize in our continued advocacy. Number one, some countries feel overwhelmed at the idea of taking these children back. They see them as distinct, different, and unlike any children in the world. But in fact, some of this, they're not so different from refugees or other children who have been affected by armed conflict and who have gone through similar hardships. Some of the same countries that have resisted repatriation have accepted thousands of refugees and have effective programs on the ground to reintegrate them. These same programs can be used for repatriated children. Secondly, we have to stress that repatriating children is not only in their best interests, but also in the interests of national security. Top UN officials, including counter-terrorism experts, have stressed that the greatest danger is not bringing them home, but leaving them in the camps, where they face potential radicalization, recruitment, and marginalization. The longer they stay, the greater the risks. And then finally, the situation is even more urgent given the recent events in Syria over the last 2 weeks. With the fall of Assad, Turkey is seeking to expand its control in northeast Syria. Hostilities between different armed groups in the region have actually escalated, which is putting children in the camps at risk from airstrikes, ground clashes, and further shortages of basics that are already scarce. Countries that still have nationals in the camps and the detention sites should repatriate them urgently. This massive detention crisis has to be resolved. The only durable solution is for governments to take their children back or help them transfer to third countries. Only then, with access to rehabilitation and reintegration services, can they start to rebuild their lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe, very much for updating us about the situation in northeast Syria. And again, it's very timely, as you said now, with everything that is happening there. And I hope that everyone will learn from the Finland experience when they said that this is best for the national security. And those children being left like that now with all the chaos that is happening, what are we expecting and of them in the future? So it's a big question that needs to be asked. So thank you very much. I have one logistical question for Alex. Alex, because on the agenda there's a Nada Nashef video statement. Can we pause that until we finish our session? Because it's 10:30 now.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
10:30. We have to put it at the end. When you finish, we will put the statement.
Okay,
Yeah.
so
There is
it's
no
not like
problem
she's
to
waiting
delay
or
a
something.
little bit,
Okay.
but not too much because.
Yeah, no, definitely. Now we're gonna conclude now with our last speaker. In Arabic, we say حسن الختام أو ختامها مسك, which is like the end is like the smell of flowers. And next to me, I have a very beautiful young lady, Tia, who is 15 years old, who just came and arrived from Lebanon to share with all of us her thoughts and ideas, and will speak from her heart about children experienced in armed conflict in Lebanon. Please welcome Tia with me, all of you, to talk to you. Yeah.
Good morning. The harm catches up the children upon armed conflict. International law affords all the children a special protection, including their right to survival. All too often, they are terrorized by ineffective warnings to flee, detained, killed, parentless, injured, attacked, traumatized, and made homeless. They are deprived of liberty, food, medical health, safety, justice. They are utilized or otherwise drawn into conflict. The consequences extend to those who survive but suffer from the loss of parents or any family member and live in traumatizing events. In addition, Israel has used the white phosphorus and depleted uranium in popular areas that affects the health of children and constitute essential warnings to long-term living in the impact region. UN Convention on the Rights of the Children must secure enjoyable protection to all children. Protection to all children affected by armed conflicts and its optional protocols, especially the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child on the Involvement of the Children in Armed Conflict, 2002, and other international standards like the international humanitarian law. The spirit of peace, dignity, tolerance, freedom, inequality, solidarity must be brought up in the spirit of ideals, proclaimed in the Charter of the United Nations to be able to enjoy their inherent right to life and be fully prepared to live on a human life in society. Furthermore, as reiterated in Article 38 of the UN Convention on the Rights of Children, international humanitarian law establishes clear rules, including on the obligation to ensure protected and care of Lebanon. The situation of Lebanon was escalating day by day. As of 7th of October, Israel's offensive since 28 November has killed around 4,000 people, including more than 400 children were killed, and 10,000 children was injured, and over 1.5 million have been forcibly displaced. We strongly condemn the killing of civilians and children by all parties to this conflict and all violation of international law. Israel's indiscriminate military operations against Lebanese population, including children, which have resulted in widespread internal displacement. The deliberate destruction of civilians' infrastructure, such as schools and hospitals, has hindered the ability of victims, particularly children, to access essential aid, protection, and care. The illegal of white phosphorus leads to soil degradation, along with the use of depleted uraniums, a toxic substance posing both chemical and radiation risks in heavily populated areas. As well, I would like to share some messages the children told me when I visited the shelters in Lebanon. They witnessed and heard the attack. They were so scared they left their homes. And do you imagine that they are not supposed to play because there is no water to shower? And when we ask a child about freedom, here was his answer. The war took from me liberty, justice, and everything. Freedom means being able to do anything, but we are trapped by shelling and war. Stop the shelling so children can go to the school. since education is the only weapon for children to fight with. As well, I want to add one more thing, that the Scout, where kids explore nature and do some sports and activities, is used to learn children, and they recruits them secretly without letting the children, without letting their parents to know. As well, they teach them how to use weapons so they can help in wars. So simply, it is the end of their lives. There's people that stayed all the day in the car and slept in the car about 24 hours so they can arrive to the school, which is the only safe place in the war. So they felt disappointed and lonely because no one is asking about them or care about their feelings. As well, there's a young girl who was always afraid when she saw a plastic bag due to the weather condition and due to the wind. When this plastic bag fly, she feels so scared and she panics because she thinks that it is going to bomb next to her. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you. Thank you, Tia. It's really hard to make any comments after what you said. So with what Tia said, I will close this session and say trauma, war, detention, suffering. This is all what the children are really witnessing, and we should be there to protect them from that. Manfred, and I think that we'll have to give all the, to leave all the discussions to the breakouts for the sake of the time, because we're already 10 minutes over our session. What, Alec? Unless the organizers will allow us for an additional 10 minutes. So it's your decision. Alex.
Hello? Yes, I would prefer that we have them, perhaps you take one question from the child and one question for an adult, and the rest of the discussion to have it just after the break. I have some announcements also because there are some people who joined us today, so we will need to announce the rooms and all the logistics because it's a complicated day. But you can take one question, so I'll leave it up to you.
The priority will go to children and then to the adults. Please, go ahead. Yes, tell me your name and your question.
I'm Amr, and I'm the child representative of DCI Palestine. I would speak Arabic.
تفضل.
هل سنرى مستقبلا أي إجراءات أو اتفاقيات أو قوانين أو بروتوكولات التي من شأنها أن تضغط على الحكومات ويغير معاملتهم مع الأطفال في سياق الأمن القومي ومكافحة الإرهاب مستقبلا؟ شكرا.
Any other questions? The kids, let's give the kids the priority first and then...
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is PC Philippa Kaido, National President from Children's Fund Network Sierra Leone. I'm being supported by Defense for Children International Sierra Leone. So my question is, how are we going to ensure that these children are disassociated from those terrorist groups, and how are we going to ensure that these children have access to justice when their rights are being violated?
Did you understand the question? Can I kindly ask you to repeat? It's not your fault, but it's the fault of the... We'll put this so we can hear better. Please go ahead.
Sure. So how are we going to ensure that these children are being disassociated from these terrorist groups? And how are we going to ensure that they have access to justice when their rights are being violated?
Thank you very much. Manfred, I can't say no to you.
No, thank you very much. I just wanted to say and congratulate the organizers. This was the most extraordinary panel that I have heard for such a long time, starting with Omar, ending with Tia, and having all these experts on there. And just two small remarks. When we did the first report on Guantanamo Bay, we had about 600 detainees still there. Now it's 27, if I'm correct, Fionnuala. Left.
3 left this morning. We were at 30
Yes.
yesterday, 27 today.
And that's the point I just wanted to make. So we don't have much time anymore, because as soon as Donald Trump takes over, I think they will remain there. So if whatever we can do also as this conference to try to put pressure on the current US administration to still release or transfer some of the remaining detainees, that would be great. And the second point also to the children in northeast Syria, there's also an urgent time factor now because of the situation and the role that Turkey is playing. And the only question I would have to Joe or whoever knows, I mean, there was progress, as you said. For instance, there's also a recent case in Austria of a court. So there is progress ongoing. But how many are there still currently? I didn't have any of the more recent data. Thank you very much for this panel.
Thank you, Manfred. Because he raised his hand first, so we'll take you and then we'll go back to the panel. تفضل.
I want to talk Arabic, please.
Can you also translate the first question that was not translated? The first question.
صباح الخير للجميع. أنا جمال جيت من الأردن، من الأرض العربية. أنا هنا لأنقل لكم مزيج من المشاعر لأطفال غزة المختلطة بالدم والبرد والجوع، لتقول لكم أن الإبادة الجماعية التي اعترف فيها القانون الدولي تستحق على الأقل أن يكون هناك جلسة خاصة تتحدث عن الوصول للعدالة في ظل حرب الإبادة. نحن نقتل صباحا ومساء وأطفالنا يحرموا من حقهم في الوصول للحياة، في الوصول للماء، في الوصول للطعام، في وجود مأوى يغطيهم من هذا الجبروت. نتحدث في ظل اعتراف بوجود جريمة إبادة، ونحن هنا بصفتنا مدافعين عن حقوق الإنسان في جميع الجلسات. كنت أتمنى أن يكون جلسة خاصة للإبادة الجماعية والحديث عن الأطفال. نحن لا نقتل فقط بالرصاص. أريد أن أطلق عنوان من هذه الجلسة: نحن لا نقتل فقط في الرصاص الإسرائيلي ولا في الدول الداعمة. من يقتل أطفالنا هو المنظومة التي أعطت الحق للدول العظمى أن تمنع وقف إطلاق النار.
شكرا جمال.
The veto kills our children.
Thank you.
الفيتو يقتل أطفالنا. هذه المنظومة الدولية إذا لم تعدل سيبقى أطفال العالم يقتلوا.
شكرا. I think enough. Thank you very much. I think that our speaker has highlighted that in different and touched upon that on different parts of their speeches. The last thing that I want to do, that I want to give 1 minute for each of our panelists to make any remarks upon the questions and the comments, and we'll start with Alexandra. Please, 1 minute each.
Thank you. I would like to respond to the question on how to ensure they have access to justice. One of the things that we have realized is the importance of focusing on recruitment. So if a child is recruited by an armed group, a criminal group, recruitment is a crime under 5 international legal regimes. So if there is the recognition, there is an urge to strengthen accountability systems to hold perpetrators of crimes against children accountable. This is the first thing. But accountability and access to justice does not need necessarily to go through the formal justice system. So I think the importance of the community-based reconciliation and restorative justice processes is something that would also allow children to have access to justice. Thank you.
I would simply say that we need to dismantle the architecture of counterterrorism that we have built over 2 decades. We need to start at the UN. We have an ever-growing architecture of counterterrorism in the UN. It needs to be significantly downsized, and we need to put an end to human rights-free counterterrorism, which is the space that we currently occupy. And I would just simply endorse Manfred's 2 comments. We have 27 men remaining at Guantanamo, Cuba, including at least one who was a child when he arrived there 20 years ago. In the next couple of weeks, it is absolutely critical that every pressure is brought to bear on the US authorities to transfer the remaining men. And on Syria, we have an extraordinary problem, and the lack of attention to the situation in the camps, both by the UN but also by member states. There are 57 member states with nationals in the camps, and those should be brought home. And that should be an absolute and categorical imperative for the Security Council and every actor in the UN system at this moment. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I have nothing to add, actually, but I just want to echo what Fionnuala said. And I want to repeat again that we have now a state guidance note on child rights mainstreaming. You have done wonderful jobs as a Special Rapporteur on human rights and counterterrorism, but now we need to focus on children. Tackling the counterterrorism regime. So, and just one word, we have discussed a lot and we already have many ideas. We need to take actions. That's my word. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
You
you.
Briefly, and I think it was from the first the delegate who spoke, as everyone has said here, we don't need new legislation, international legislation. We need to respect the one that we have. And so I think it is, again, a clarion call for us to do much more to put pressure on member states who are the arbiters here. That's it.
Thank you.
Manfred asked how many of the 29,000 children that we said were detained 5 years ago are still in the camps in northeast Syria and the detention facilities. We have pretty accurate figures that 2,200 children have been repatriated to various countries around the world. The question mark is how many have been repatriated to Iraq. We know that they've accepted more than 10,000 back, but we don't know how many of those are children. So my best estimate is that somewhere between 20 and 25,000 children remain. Thank you.
I just want to emphasize on the point that these titles of terrorism have been abused by a lot of state governments, and I think we need to do away with these titles because in the end, people are people, and it's about human rights, not about whether the children or the child is deemed a terrorist or not. We need to get rid of these titles and just go back to the basics, which is human rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much all. Thanks for all the distinguished speakers for amazing presentations and discussion. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see the rest of you who's interested in this topic specifically at the breakout sessions that will take place shortly. Alex, to you.
Yes, thank you so much. Extremely interesting panel. Congratulations to all. So first of all, as I said, we will have a 2-minute statement, a 3-minute statement from the Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights, Madame Nada Al-Nashrif, who unfortunately wanted to be with us, but she has a mission and she's not in Geneva, but she left this video message. Some very important practical information, because today we will change rooms and formats, and some joined today, they don't have the program, so the first thing they should go and register on the other side in front of room E and F. There's always the Secretariat and they can provide you with the documentation and the program. We will have a late break just after this, after the statement. The break would be the same place as always, so by the exhibition on Palestine and the children's exhibition, which is in space Wangari Maathai. Then after the break, you will split, and you have chosen in principle yesterday, but those who have not chosen, they should choose now, in 4 groups. They will be following the plenaries, so there will be one for administration of justice, and it will be in room F. Room F is the half of the plenary we had yesterday. They will be moderated by Ton Lifford, Professor Ton Lifford, and Rapporteur Margaret Tweed. The second group will be in room 15 for the institutions, and it will be moderated and co-moderated with Professor Davidson and other members of the group. And then Miriam Black will be the rapporteur. The third breakout parallel will be on children on the move, deprived of liberty, and it will be commemorated by Nantina and Rana Rafahi from PRI, and it will be in room 11 and 12. Sorry, I didn't mention the institutions. Institutions will be in room 15. Children on the move on room 11, 12 together, joined. And then the last group, which is the follow-up of this discussion, will be in room E. Room E, so this debate will have hybrid and English and Arabic. Nantina with Children on the Move will have hybrid, and it will be in English. And the first one, Administration of Justice, will have English, French, Arabic, and it will be hybrid. That means that also followers and online could attend these 3. The only one who is not online, unfortunately, it's institutions. There is a spare room, so room 16, so it can be used if you want to break out to smaller groups, and it's possible to have it. The other thing I wanted to emphasize is that tomorrow we will meet again in plenary as yesterday, so room EF, because all the day today, after there will be lunch at 12:30, so we will have to do a first session of 1 hour instead of 1.5, but there is another hour and a half after lunch always in the same groups, and then you have the side events which you can find in the program, and will be in the similar groups. But please follow all this in the program. If you haven't signed, you have for our donors. We have to register you every day, so please sign the registration at the entrance, or either here or in the Secretariat, which will be going back to in front of room E and F. So now the short statement of the Deputy High Commissioner, and then we go to the break.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear children, good morning. Let me start by thanking the organizers for convening this timely and important conference on justice for children deprived of their liberty. 5 years on from the adoption of the landmark global study on children deprived of liberty, far too many children around the world continue to be deprived of this liberty in contexts such as the administration of justice, in prison with their caregivers, in institutions, in armed conflict more and more, and on national security grounds. The global study shone light on the ways in which children are deprived of their liberty, on the conditions they face, and on the devastating lifelong impact that detention has on their rights, including their physical and mental health, on their education, as well as their long-term survival and development, to name just a few. These children often remain invisible, with limited access to justice for violations of their rights. International human rights law is clear. Children should only be deprived of their liberty as a measure of last resort and for the shortest appropriate period of time possible. In principle, it should be avoided. This cannot be stressed enough. International law establishes the obligations for states, notably the Convention of the Rights of the Child and its optional protocols, including on a communications procedure allowing children to access justice when it cannot be secured at national level. The international framework also contains numerous international standards and norms. When it comes to detention in the justice system, for example, General Comment 24 of the Committee on the Rights of the Child provides clear guidelines for states on how to establish child justice systems in compliance with the Convention. I also welcome the focus of the committee's current draft General Comment number 27 on children's rights to access to justice and effective remedies, which will establish guidance for states on what access to justice to children really involves and how to ensure accountability for all children everywhere. The global study contains a series of important recommendations on preventing the detention of children and on addressing its root causes in a systemic and coordinated manner to allow children to survive, indeed, to reach their full potential. Progress around the world is often slow, and turning these standards into reality remains a significant challenge. It will take a strong collective effort to achieve change, but we must not lose hope. While we are seeing a pushback against children's rights in some countries, others are leading the way. And just one example, this year, the Scottish Parliament passed legislation to keep children out of prison, ending the placement of under-18s in young offenders institutions. Looking ahead to the World Congress on Justice with Children in Madrid next year, I reaffirm my commitment to working for the rights of children deprived of their liberty everywhere. I call for the recommendations of the global study to be urgently implemented and ask you all to stand up today and every day for the rights of children everywhere. Thank you very much.
So everybody can go now for a break. We'll make 20 minutes, and it's in Wangari Maathai.
Do you have a minute?